Welcome to the second in our occasional series of textile talks. Today we're going to be talking about an Indonesian batik from the Kerek area on the north coast of Java. This is the cloth beside me on the wall. It's a selendang, a shoulder cloth. For those of you who are familiar with Indonesian batik, I think you can see straight away this is not your typical Indonesian batik. The cloths which we normally think about when we think about batik from this part of the world are formal courtly pieces like this with many colours, usually made on imported cotton cloth with multiple colours. These days the production of these cloths is very standardised in large workshops, and a certain amount of the drawing is done by hand, but the bulk of it is done with large copper stamps like this one. The Kerek cloth I've got beside me here is quite a different animal. It's made on hand-spun cotton, which is locally grown and locally spun and locally woven. And as you can see, it's entirely in indigo, and the designs have been drawn entirely by hand, using a little tool called the chanting, which is like the one I've got here. And this is a cloth which is giving us some clues as to what batik might have looked like in Indonesia when it was first introduced. This tradition is unique. Sandra Sarjono and I visited this area last year. The designs are also very interesting. They're very organic. This one consists of water plants and birds and what might be animals, all sort of mingled together in a design which is a little bit reminiscent of the sort of vegetation you'd find in a paddy field, which of course the area is surrounded with. There are also some very interesting connections with this cloth, with mainland Asia and with mainland traditions that are telling us something interesting about the history of this area, and these are the things I want to explore today. Turning first of all to the loom on which the cloth was made and the process by which this cloth was produced. It's not the kind of frame loom that you're used to on the Asian mainland. It's a ground level loom. Looks a bit like a classic Austronesian loom with a circular warp, like this example from Flores. But it has a couple of interesting modifications and enhancements to it. It's got a reed, which means that the weaver can control the warp spacing very precisely and get a balanced plane weave at the price of some extra work in the warping and setting up process, because you've got to feed the warps through these individual reed dents. It's also got a flat warp, which means that instead of the circular warp you see on a classic Austronesian loom, the warp starts out as being wound onto the warp beam. And it's gradually unwound as the weaving progresses, and the finished cloth is wound onto the cloth beam. And this means that you can make a much longer piece of cloth than you could with the classic Austronesian circular loom. The loom is something which was formerly very common in Java and Sumatra. You can still find it in the Palembang area. It used to be in Surabaya as well, within living memory. And it was used to make a lot of different types of cloth. As you can see, it's a ground level loom. The weaver sits on the ground or very close to it or on a mat, and beats in the warp by hand with a warp beater, and you can see the reed there at the front of the loom, which is used to control that warp spacing. The product is a hand-spun cloth with nice texture. The Kerek people in this area also use locally produced brown cotton, which they use undyed in some of their cloths and get some interesting effects with. But most of the cotton is white. They also, in addition to batik, make cloth that we call lurik, which is striped and checked cloth, normally with some ikat dashes in as well. How about the designs on the cloth? I want to draw your attention to a couple of interesting comparisons. The first comparison is with mainland batik traditions. because this at first sight looks more similar to some cloths using the batik process which are produced on the mainland than it does to classical Indonesian batik. Now there are a couple of different ways in which batik is produced. One way is to use a paste resist, like rice paste, typically with a stencil. So what you do is you take your stencil and you apply the paste through the stencil, let it dry, and then dip it in the indigo bath. And this is the way that indigo bedspreads and other items have been made all across the Asian mainland for a very long time. Most of rural China formerly made bedspreads of this type in this way, though this tradition is not something which has been well documented. Batik is also very important in southwest China and parts of Southeast Asia. And in these areas, some of the batik workers use a very similar technique to the technique that the Kerek people use. They use beeswax as a resist, and this is applied with a tool like this chanting. The one technique which is most similar to this is probably that used by Hmong people in North Vietnam and in southern China, who also use beeswax, who make cloths decorated on cotton and hemp, with a very similar kind of feeling to this one. And the tools are so similar that they're almost certainly related. The other comparison that I want to show you today is with blue and white ceramics. This is a completely different source of design inspiration, but it was something that was very important in trade in Southeast Asia from the 14th and 15th century onwards, both in Chinese and Vietnamese ceramics. And here, one of the interesting features is that many of these ceramics feature designs with fish and water weeds, and they have a kind of informal, spiky appearance to them, which is quite reminiscent of this Kerek cloth. These kinds of ceramics, maybe 17th or 18th century pieces, have been found all along the coast of Java, and were probably a source of design inspiration. They're still found in many Indonesian homes. In the outer islands, they're important heirloom objects. So the textile here is particularly important for its position in the history of Indonesian batik. And it's also telling us the story of contacts between Javanese batik makers and mainland traditions. So we've seen that the Kerek loom is quite distinctive and unique to that area, but it has some interesting connections with mainland looms. Specifically, it has borrowed a couple of elements, the reed and the flat warp, from mainland types. So this is a Thai loom, for example, from the Asian mainland, from northern Vietnam. And you can see from the picture that it has, it's a very different animal. It's a loom with a large frame, but it has the flat warp and the reed, which are characteristic of looms all across North Vietnam and China. And these are elements that seem to have come down the Malaysian peninsula and have been borrowed by weavers in Java and Sumatra and reapplied to the old Austronesian style loom with a circular warp to make this unique hybrid form. The distribution of the loom is very interesting. It's found in, as I mentioned, in Java and Sumatra. The same loom is also found in Lombok, in Bali, southern Sulawesi, and parts of southern coastal Philippines. It probably originated somewhere in Java or Sumatra, but it seems to have been carried by traders in the last few hundred years to these coastal locations around this western part of the archipelago. So one textile, it may not look much on its own, it's an attractive piece of cloth, but the history behind it and what it's telling us is a record of trade and contacts between Indonesian people and the Asian mainland going back hundreds or possibly thousands of years. Thank you for listening.